Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for being here tonight to watch Charles Yu talk about his new novel, Interior Chinatown. We are also joined by Leslie Bowe. She is a professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Leslie, thank you so much for being here as well. And Charles, thank you for joining us today. I know author events remote aren't exactly as great as they are in person, but at least you get to, be in your home and see your kids and maybe have dinner with your family tonight. I want to take a short second to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors for making this year's Wisconsin Book Festival possible. Their support of free cultural events for the last 8 years, but particularly throughout the pandemic, has been absolutely unwavering. We couldn't do this without them, and so thank you to all of the decision makers and all of our donors. I also want to just mention this is the second to last week of Wisconsin Book Festival events for the year. Tomorrow we have the poet Aria Aber and Elizabeth Powell. And then after Thanksgiving, we'll be hosting Danielle Evans for her new novel, The Office of Historical Corrections, and Jane Smiley for her latest novel, Perestroika in Paris. So we hope that you'll join us for at least one of our last couple of events, and we thank you so much all for being here tonight to see Charles talk with Leslie. So I'm going to step away and turn it over to Charles and Leslie. Thank you so much. See you
Thank
later.
you so much, Connor. We're so happy to be here with Charlie Yu. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to the Wisconsin Book Festival, the Center for Humanities, and the Asian American Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Charlie here 4 years ago. He is the author of 4 books, including the novel How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, which was a New York Times notable book and a Time Magazine Best Book of the Year. He also received, which is part of the reason we had him out 4 years ago, the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award. And he's been nominated since that time for 2 Writers Guild of America Awards for his work on the HBO series Westworld. He's also written for television, for shows on FX and AMC, and his fiction and nonfiction have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Wired, among so many other publications. The main reason that he is here, of course, today is that he has a new novel, Interior Chinatown, out just this year. And also, to mention, he has been nominated for the National Book Award in fiction. So congratulations, Charlie, and welcome back to Madison, at least virtually. We were talking a little bit about the last time that we chatted, and that was October in 2016. Really different context for your coming. And do you remember your visit here to Madison from warm LA at all?
I do. Thank you, Professor Bowe. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for everyone in the audience who I can't see, but I'm thrilled. I wish I could have come to Madison. I had quite a memorable visit last time, and I um, for a couple of reasons. One was my flight before the night before was actually delayed till very early the next morning. So, which is like my worst, probably everyone's nightmare, but really mine on many levels, because I was already taking off work, and then I had the already added anxiety of, am I going to make it on time to the reading that later that day? So I'm traveling day of, and so I went back. It was in LAX. I went back into my car and tried to sleep for a couple of hours, and I don't know what exactly happened. It's sort of like when you sleep in a tent, but I woke up a couple hours later, sort of drenched in like a morning dew that had somehow settled in my car. I got on the flight. I was exhausted, and I think I rambled incoherently in Madison. So it was quite, but I had a lot of fun, and it was a beautiful place. I wish I could have spent longer there. But yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm really thank you to like the festival and the public library and all the sponsors. And to Connor, thank you so much.
Yeah, so yes, folks, in order to be here 4 years ago, he had to sleep in his car, but he was game and we did a wonderful interview. And things were so different back then because you were just starting to write for HBO, correct? At the time that we're speaking, and that you had just started working on Westworld, right?
I had just started working on an HBO show, but it was actually my second HBO show. It was a
Yeah.
show for Alan Ball called Here and Now, and which I loved. He's a great guy, and it was a great writer's room. But I had finished Westworld earlier that year,
Okay.
and I was still relatively new to TV, and it was just really kind of finding my way into that arena.
And of course that has borne fruit in terms of interior Chinatown. And before you do our reading, just to say that this novel in the form of a partly a television screenplay, you're able to meld those two genres together really nicely in this work.
Thanks. I tried. It took a long time. Actually, when we were talking, and this is one of my lessons learned slash regrets, but also now I guess it's sort of funny. I In our interview, I told you the title of the book at that time,
I know.
and I think it was the Book of Wishing. It also had more titles after that. It had more titles before that. The book had about 6 titles over its life, um, and so lesson learned is don't ever tell somebody, especially when it's going to be in print, the title of the novel you have not finished yet. Very bad idea.
But I'm assuming that this is a completely different novel from the one we talked about 4 years ago?
It it is. It is, and it sort of is and is not. It has some of the DNA, I guess, or there are passages that would be recognizable for sure, but it's been completely overhauled. And the novel 4 years ago did not have any kind of screenplay format at all. It was a magical realist story about a lot of the same topics, but I just had not found the right housing for the novel yet, I guess.
And that's where it's particularly exciting to see you write in this melding of these genres in a kind of magical real way with a television drama and with real history, which I'm hoping we'll talk about after you do a reading. So what are you planning to read for us tonight?
Well, I'd love to read from the beginning. People that have heard it. I thank you for read it. Thank you for reading it. And if you haven't, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Um, but yeah, I think I'll read a few pages just from the very beginning of the book.
Okay.
Interior Chinatown. Interior Golden Palace. Ever since you were a boy, you've dreamt of being Kung Fu Guy. You are not Kung Fu Guy. You are currently Background Oriental Male, but you've been practicing. Maybe tomorrow will be the day. Interior Golden Palace. Ever since you were a boy, you've dreamt of being Kung Fu Guy. You are not Kung Fu Guy. You are currently Oriental Guy making a weird face, but you've been practicing. Maybe tomorrow will be the day. Take what you can get. Try to build a life at the margin, made from bit parts. Willis Wu, Asian actor. Skills: Kung Fu, moderate proficiency. Fluent in accented English. Able to do face of great shame on command. Resume: Disgraced Son. Delivery guy. Silent henchman. Guy who runs in and gets kicked in the face. Striving immigrant. Generic Asian man. Your mother has played, in no particular order, Pretty Oriental Flower, Asiatic Seductress, Young Dragon Lady, Slightly Less Young Dragon Lady, restaurant hostess, beautiful maiden number one, dead beautiful maiden number one, old Asian woman. Your father has been, at various times, twin dragon, wizened Chinaman, guy in a soiled t-shirt, inscrutable grocery owner in a soiled t-shirt, egg roll cook, young Asian man, Sifu, the mysterious kung fu master, old Asian man. Interior golden palace, morning. In the world of black and white, everyone starts out as generic Asian man. Everyone who looks like you, anyway. Unless you're a woman, in which case you start out as pretty Asian woman. You all work at Golden Palace, formerly Jade Palace, formerly Palace of Good Fortune. There's an aquarium in the front, and cloudy tanks of rock crabs and 2-pound lobsters crawling over each other in the back. Laminated menus offer the lunch special, which comes with a bowl of fluffy white rice and choice of soup, egg drop or hot and sour. A neon Qingdao sign blinks and buzzes behind the bar in the dimly lit space, a dropped ceiling room with lacquered ornate woodwork, or some imitation thereof, everything simmering in a warm, seedy red glow, thrown off by the dollar store paper lanterns festooned above, many of them darkened by dead moths, the paper yellowing, ripped, curling in on itself. You wear the uniform, white shirt, black pants, black slipper-like shoes that have no traction whatsoever. Your haircut is not good, to say the least. Black and white always look good. A lot of it has to do with the light. They're the heroes. They get the hero lighting, designed to hit their faces just right. Designed to hit White's face just right anyway. Someday you want the light to hit your face like that, to look like the hero, or for a moment, to actually be the hero. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that reading. I have to say, Charlie, I was like laughing out loud. Luckily, my microphone is off when you said guy who gets kicked in the face. And you said that so straight-facedly. It's so funny because humor is so much part of this novel. But you were just like very stoic when you read guy who gets kicked in the face. And I have to ask you about the humor of this work because I found it very funny. And is that something that you're thinking about strategically, or when you're writing it, do you actually start laughing out loud to yourself?
I don't make myself laugh that often. I kind of make myself amused, I guess, at best. And if it's amusing, then I think this might be amusing to someone else. But yeah, I'm not. The thing that humor really does for me is that I think it's a compass for when I'm getting into a place that I'm not that comfortable. And so I know that when I start to go, oh, that's maybe interesting or true, it usually overlaps a bit with stuff that I'm like, oh, someone might find that funny. But yeah, I'm not, I'm not like going for the jokes, but it's usually a good indication that I'm onto something.
And these characters that, and especially in the segment that you read, all are all Hollywood types. And I have to ask you, what were the inspiration? What was the inspiration for the novel, but also what was the inspiration for all the types that you are mentioning of the very limited roles that Asian Americans get in Hollywood?
Yeah, a few sources really. I am in my 40s and I grew up, in the 80s and 90s watching a lot of TV and not seeing Asian faces, just very rare occurrence. And when you did see Asian faces, or when I saw them, it'd be a little bit of a game, right, with the family. Like, oh my, is that's an Asian, and then it's invariably background person not talking, and more there as scenery than as a character. Um, and there really are types. You know, there's the if it's a guy, it's some guy who's like smoking a cigarette and scratching his butt, or a shopkeeper who doesn't, almost always with an accent. Somebody affiliated with a restaurant usually, or doing martial arts. If it's a woman, often exoticized or sexualized. And so these are sort of this is like the basis for like the types that you see, or I saw anyway growing up, watching American TV and film. And I think a recent sort of development is progress. I see now, I have kids that are 11 and 13, and when we watch stuff as a family, we see things moving forward. We see definitely more Asian and Asian Americans on screen in much better parts and roles. And still we also sometimes see types and accents. So in starting to write the book, I just felt like there's a sense in which we move forward, but there's a sense in which sometimes feels like, are we really moving forward, or is this cyclical, and are we going to end up 10 years from now thinking, you know how come we never move forward? So
Yeah, and back in the day, my parents would do that same thing when they watched television, and this was back in the 60s, that my mother would rush to the TV and say, "Dad, there's an Oriental girl. There's an Oriental girl."
yeah.
And I have to say, it was one of the sources that you're referring to, because this comes out in the representation of your child character, Phoebe, was one of the sources, Ni Hao Kailan.
Yeah, definitely. uh I guess it's pretty obvious, but yes. Xie Xie Mei Mei is the is the Nihao Kailan derivative. I hope I don't have to pay royalties or get sued for copyright, but yeah, I think that's an interesting example, right? It's pretty cool to see
Mhm.
cartoon like that, which is definitely all about probably trying to bridge some cultural understanding through language, through
Mhm.
you know um, through having characters and stories that are set in this world. So pretty cool.
So it was probably pretty fun to do some research for this novel. Am I wrong? Or is research the wrong word? Did you actually go back to watch Bruce Lee and or any of those, yeah, I guess, NCS, whatever the police procedurals, Law and Order, did you literally go back to some of those sources to actually sit down and say, okay, let me think about the genre of this sitcom or drama, television drama?
I did. I mean, there was some research. There was, I guess you could call it, deep background research years before, when my kids were infants, and I would spend a lot of hours um, trying to get them to go to sleep or keep them asleep, or keep them from waking up my wife so she could sleep a little bit. And that involved a lot of watching Law and Order SVU. Uh, for whatever reason, I could always find that on. I think it's been said that at any given time, Law and Order is on somewhere in the world. Definitely true. Has to be true. It's probably true even in the U.S. Um, I just sort of like mass binged before binging was a thing, like SVU episodes, and I guess that sort of seared into my brain this idea. And it wasn't until a few years later I started working on the book, but yeah, I guess that was part of the research. I also did a little bit of research in terms of like reading about Chinatowns and some of the history there. But a lot of it was like the formative experiences growing up of like I was talking about, just 40 some years of not seeing Asians anywhere in popular culture for the most part, except
Mm.
for when it's Bruce Lee or
Kung
or
Fu guy.
yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one of the differences from when we had spoken 4 years ago. One of the questions that I had posed to you is that, well, it seems that so many audiences in Asian American studies are really flocking to your work. And yet it was not necessarily conscious, right, on your part. And I had asked you, well, is that because of your background, or is there something else in the work itself? And it seems to me that one of the differences between 4 years ago and now is that in interior Chinatown, we actually do get quite a bit of history. In fact, in the middle, it reminds me of Maxine Hong Kingston's, Chinamen, in which she has this wonderful narrative and prose, like non-creative nonfiction. And in the middle of the chapter is just, here's history.
Mm.
There you go. Was that deliberate on your part to mirror that structure? It's like, let me just give you the history. We're on a TV show, but here's Asian American exclusion. With that, what were you thinking?
I think so. I mean, I think of it like, yeah, sneaking in the vegetable. Like I got you in with the kung fu and the screenplay, and then now here's a bunch of legal cases. Uh, and some of that mirrored the structure of a Law and Order episode where it switches, but some of it was, I think, always part of what I wanted to do, which was turn it toward this idea of exclusion and of what it feels like, to be excluded from the narrative, from the popular imagination, and what that does to, how that sort of deforms your sense of who you are. Not just your sense, not just an Asian American sense, but how it deforms other people's sense of the same thing. How if you're white or black or Latino, Latinx or anything else, and you never see a certain kind of face on screen except for these three ways, what does that do to your conception of that group? And then, so I think there's exclusion in that sense. And then I don't know if it was a happy accident or by design, somewhere in the middle, probably the actual exclusion, of many people, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but these sort of national quotas, that existed for many decades, that were explicitly barred groups from coming here, and what that does to not just your imagination, but to actually the legal and political status of these groups. So it felt like, it felt organic to me, and yeah, I think at some point I realized, oh, I'm really doing this. I have to put legal cases in here, but I was excited because it actually fit the form.
Oh, and I think it totally worked. I mean, that's my meat and potatoes, not my vegetable, but that's fine. Uh, I have to ask you, because you're talking about a lot of these types, and part of the consciousness of Willis is to realize that he had in fact been conditioned by social structure to become in fact one of these types, generic Asian man. And I have to ask you, in terms of that connection to your own life and your own biography, are those awarenesses that you yourself have gone through over the course of years? Are you ever aware of yourself as performing a role, which in a way that's so potent for your main character?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that was, I don't know if I can pinpoint exactly. I don't know that there is an exact point of that realization. It's, um, a slow thing over time that somehow crystallizes, where then you wake up one day and you're like, oh, I internalize all of this myself. And so, um, I think, uh, some of it came from working for many years as a lawyer while I was writing. I was working in the legal field in largely all white environments. And, even in writers' rooms, I'm often, I think with one exception, I've been the only Asian in the room.
Mhm.
So, I think in the course of this book, not that this book is therapy for me, but I did, it took me to sort of come to terms with some of that myself, with how much have I created this perception of myself and fashioned this performance, this outward facing version of me, based on what I think people are expecting. And there was it's somewhat painful sometimes to realize, oh, I'm doing this to myself sometimes. Yeah.
So were you playing, what kind of Asian role were you playing in the writer's room? I have to ask. So how does that consciousness come out? I mean, how do you become aware of how to externalize the especially racial perceptions that people have of you in order to play that role? And you and I had actually talked about the notion of imposture, right? That was coming through so strongly in your work, not necessarily in a racial sense. And what I love about Interior Chinatown is actually very foregrounded, that race is a role that we perform through the expectations of others. And I think that's really magical and also really fascinating. But of course, you and I, in your previous work, like in Third Class Superhero, had actually talked about the notion of imposture and performance and the idea of expectations, in terms of who we become. So it seems to me very much of a continuation of the work that you had been writing before. I'm not sure if you see it that way as well.
No, I definitely do. And not surprised that a professor of English and Asian American Studies is the one to diagnose it so well, but it's absolutely a continuation. And I think that's part of why I searched for a long time for the right voice and entry point to this book. It had to feel to me anyway like a step forward, but not such a break with everything else that I not that it wouldn't be okay to do that. I just felt, I guess, not quite confident enough, at least at the beginning. If I needed to find a way that felt like an extension of what I had done before. So as you point out, my first book is called Third Class Superhero. It's about a third class superhero, a guy who doesn't feel like he belongs in the league of superheroes. He's at the very bottom rung, and even there, he's struggling to stay on. Um, then my novel, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, is about a time machine repairman who, again, is a sort of, it's a science fictional story about a guy who is who has a kind of almost paralyzing self-consciousness about, uh, to the point where it's hard for him to move forward in time. Um, and here Willis Wu is a generic Asian man number three. Again, a protagonist who really doesn't feel like they should be the protagonist. That if I had to, reduce everything, my my kind of inclination, that's what I'm really drawn to, is like who are the characters who are not used to being front and center, and what can you do to um, sub- give them a subjective interior life.
And who would play Willis Wu if this were a movie?
This or a movie? It's a good
Well,
question.
it is kind of a movie, right?
Yeah. Um, you know, I have actors I really love, but I also think that there would be something really cool about and fitting about discovering someone totally unknown. Uh, One, because I think that would make sense for production. Um, you, if you recognize somebody sort of famous already as Willis Wu, that's not that's not exactly, you're starting that character off on the wrong foot, I think, with sort of audience perception. Whereas this should literally be someone you've never seen before, and they have to grow into their role as like, oh, I belong here. I have a story that's worth telling. Even if it's not a blockbuster story, I want to be, I want to have my own story and be part of something bigger. So.
So you're not going to say John Cho, and you're not going to say your brother.
I'm a
How
huge
could
fan.
you?
No,
Oh,
that's
oh, well, don't tell him that. You didn't say that. Um, I have to ask you a little bit about that merging between writing literary fiction and also writing for Hollywood. And I'm sure a lot of people want to know, like, how do the two feed together, or is it more of a blockage? What is it like for a literary writer to hang out in Hollywood?
uh, it feels a little bit like a cross between like grown up fantasy baseball camp where like people pay money to go to their major league. I'm like, what am I doing here? You know, uh, because it's a second career. I worked for 13 years as a lawyer. You know, I no question. I was like, I'm a lawyer. This is what I'll do until I retire, and I was perfectly happy doing that and writing, you know, as my passion. And so on the one hand, I still um, am. I don't know that I'll ever completely get used to it in that sense. The other part is I think for some of the reasons we've already talked about, sort of always used to feeling like an outsider, like a tourist, you know, in whatever environment I wandered into, whether it's a law firm or a Hollywood writer's room. I'm like, what am I doing here? And so I'm probably having, you know, more fun than I should. Sometimes I'll look around, I realize, oh, I don't mind this because I could also be in a fluorescent lit room reviewing contracts, but instead I'm here, you know, talking about stories. So I'd rather be doing this. So I personally, it hasn't worn off yet. Talk to me in a couple more years, maybe I'll be jaded and sick of it.
But does that mean that we're going to get to see more Asian American parts with you in the writer's room?
Um, Maybe. I hope so. I'd like to have a part in that, especially through the stuff I write, you know, myself. And yeah, I mean, if and when I, you know, get to work on someone else's show again, you know, on staff, you know, it doesn't always go in terms of a neat correspondence. Like I'm going to be the writer for this character. You know, the Asian character is written by the Asian American writer. That, you know, as you would, you know, not that you suggested that, but I mean, it is exciting to be parts of rooms that are more diverse in many ways, and that they're seeking out stories from lots of points of view. That's really exciting, and if I can be some small part of that, I definitely want to be.
And shifting then to the inspiration of the screenplay or for this novel, I wanted to ask you about what for you, what comes first? Is it the theme or the seed of an idea or a message? Is it the character voice, or is it the form of the novel itself? And I when I was going back and looking at some of the things that you had said about your writing before, I found it interesting that you use the word gimmick and wrapper to talk about the form of a, like a short story written from the perspective of science fiction or a television show, or that you have, I love this story that you wrote that was about probability, and another story that you wrote whose center was calculus. And so all these forms or wrappers are really intriguing. And I'm wondering, you've done science fiction, you've done humor slash horror, now you've done this form of the screenplay. What comes first for you? The concept, seed of idea, or actually what you called the wrapper?
Hmm. Um, it's a really good question. I think the short answer is that it varies, but it's usually one of two things, which is the form will come first, um, but it feels like an empty shell
Mhm.
unless and until there's some language or something really like that can fill that shell. So if it's an emotion, you know, if it's the form plus, oh, here's a character, like for instance this book, it was um it it was the first lines of the book is, you know, ever since you're a boy you've dreamt of being kung fu guy. I think that hasn't happened to me, but I had, I think, a character and uh, an arc, I guess, in TV terms, already wrapped up there. And then the question was, am I really going to write this as a screenplay? But other times, like with How to Live Safely, um, it wasn't the concept first. It was I searched for a long time. I was trying to write this kind of sci-fi story, um, and it didn't get going until I realized that there was this father-son story at the heart of it. So
Mhm.
that emotion, that sort of relationship, is what powered the machine, so to speak. And usually, what it, on like the practical level, for anyone that might be interested in the sort of the the writing, the craft part of it, is I, I'm really interested in like what kinds of sentences that form is going to allow me to do. uh,
Hmm.
and so, if that makes any sense, I don't know if it does, but
Well, I want to go back to that, like the seed or the kernel of the idea, because when you said that How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe was the kernel of the father-son relationship, I see that going so strongly, right, throughout your work as a whole. In fact, I remember the first, one of the stories you had actually written, I can't remember if it's in your first volume or the second one, is actually a television show, sitcom, about a mother and a son.
right.
So again, the fictional form, the almost surreal notion that we're, as a parent and a adult child, playing a role with our parents is so much of what you're exploring in Interior Chinatown, but also in the science fictional universe and the short story that you're doing before. And it's why you keep coming back to the adult child and parent relationship. What's so compelling about that to you?
Well, first, you're the very first person, and maybe the only person, who will call out that story. My Last Days as Me, which was in my first book. So
Oh,
uh, I totally appreciate that. I had actually not thought about that for a long time. I think maybe the thought occurred to me during the writing of this a couple of times, but it's been a while since I had thought about that story. Um, I I don't know. The short answer is I don't know why the topics that that I'm obsessed with, I keep coming back to. Um, I, I'm I'm I think um, it's what's in my heart. I mean, I think that these relationships that are the first ones we have, and in a lot of cases are the ones that will endure until the end. Um, it's just what I go to, and this weird activity of searching all over the universe for bizarre forms and then returning right back to the same topic, but now with this new form. I don't
but
know. That's sort of a weird activity, I guess.
but I that's what I love about your work, and I think that's why, almost the meta quality of how you're using these established genres, and then you're kind of twisting it, right, to make it essentially really human and emotional story. It's not about the fanciness of fantasy and the blindiness of science fiction. Its core is always about, well, here are some human relationships that somehow are getting stuck, right? Which is what happens in the course of your Interior Chinatown as well. Like, if you would say that Willis Wu is stuck in some sense in the course of the novel, what is inhibiting him?
Um, I mean, I think a large part of it is himself. He's unable to see himself uh, in a way, partly through his own fault and partly through external, conditioning. He has a very strong idea. He is almost a kind of, similar to other characters I've had, a very debilitating self-consciousness. He doesn't he doesn't think that he belongs in the scene. He doesn't think he's worthy to literally talk, and so um, it takes him a while to get there.
And you and I are having a really nice chat, but I want to remind the audience that we are also taking questions from the audience. And I'm hoping at some point we can move to that. I'm looking at my chat to get those questions from our listeners. But that happen to be from now, we just learned from all over the world. So that's actually very exciting. You're sitting in your home in Orange County, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we're waiting for some audience questions, but while I have you here, here's a question from an audience member. How did you decide on a second person point of view?
Uh, it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Uh, I tried everything else and nothing else worked. Literally was process of, it was scary. For anyone who, wants to write or is writing, or uh, I, you might be familiar with this. I just couldn't, I felt like I had the book, or at least the beginning of it, and yet something felt wrong. It was like trying on something and you're like, I just don't know what it is. Everything about this seems to fit, and it doesn't, And so I tried first person, and then I would scrap it, and then I would rewrite the whole thing. Not the whole, it wasn't a whole book at that point, but it's probably 100 pages. I would redo it all in third person. This is also a form of procrastination, by the way. I would just, I would go, oh, well, today is going to have to be me doing a global find and replace and switching all of this back. And I literally did that a couple of times, going first, third, first, third. And I was like, what am I doing? And some part of my subconscious was like, you dummy, it's in second person. And then another part of my subconscious was like, that's a really bad idea, don't do that. And so I wrestled with that for a while, and I don't know how exactly I came to terms with it, but well, I do actually, is I needed to have a good reason to do it. And I think the reason was that the second person gives us both the imposition of a narrative on Willis, right? It feels at times like an external narrator telling Willis what to do, but then it can shift at times to, I hope, to be something more complex that feels like it's coming internally. And that flexibility was what interested me. Chiang-Rae Lee's book, On Such a Full Sea, used not the same device, but a similarly kind of flexible point of or perspective, and I thought that was really brilliantly done. So I think I stole from that a little bit.
That actually leads us to our next audience question, which is, what titles have you been enjoying reading in 2020?
Yeah, it is a great question. I read and enjoyed Megha Majumdar's A Burning, which has gotten a lot of really great notice. And let's see, I read Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings earlier this year. Loved that book. I really enjoyed Weather by Jenny Offill. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but and there's so many. I mean, I'm just gonna forget a bunch, but there's a debut coming out called Nights When Nothing Happened by Simon Hahn, which I think it's out today, maybe. So that's been really fun. I got to do an event with Simon earlier this year, and now I'll be interviewing him for his book next month. So
Ooh, nice. Here's another question that goes to the genre question that you and I were talking about from an audience member. How do you navigate through all the different genres? You've done science fiction, magical realism, screenplay, etc. What do you find to be something in common between them? And what are some of the major differences?
That's a great question as well. The common thing, I guess, for me is in a well-defined genre, you get to have tropes and conventions, and those are very rich in terms of how do you play off of them, because they already do work for you, either in terms of audience expectations or audience or reader. Readers know how to read these kinds of stories, and so you're getting to basically leverage off of the expertise of the reader when you try to write a detective story, or you try to write a science fiction story. And so it already becomes a kind of collaborative act, or maybe not collaborative, yes, but also um, almost interactive, intertextual, because you get to play off of associations that other people already know from past works or from the genre in general. And that's what one thing that I think draws me to both genres and just forms that are received is the reader already carries into it some sort of preconception that you can then use to either subvert or, you know, to your advantage in other ways. So, and I mean, differences, you know, they're all very different, and I don't profess to be an expert in any of them, or even an amateur. I think I'm a tourist.
Yeah, okay, so here's a really specific question. What was it like writing this book while you were working on Westworld? If I'm not mistaken, aside from the episode in Japan, neither the Westworld itself or the lab has that many Asian characters.
Hmm. It is a great point and question. I wrote in the first season. Um, there is one. There was one Asian, character of Asian descent in the first season, who is a kind of lab tech, basically. For anyone that hasn't seen the show, and he's very funny and good, and it's a great sort of secondary or even maybe tertiary storyline. Um, I think on that show in particular, there's an easy explanation for the lack of Asian characters, which is it's supposed to be set in the Old West. But you could also say, where are the railroad workers, for instance? Why not have that storyline? You know, it's I think in that particular case, that story was quite baked. You know, we walked into the room and the pilot had been shot, and showrunners who are very, very uh, good at what they do, they knew what they wanted, and so we were there to help them tell that story. Um, but yeah, it can be, not just for Westworld, but for other stories. Sometimes it can be um, tricky because sometimes you get one Asian character and then you're thinking, well, is that the mouthpiece? And do I have some kind of responsibility or opportunity to use that, or not use that character, but to write for that character in a way that reaches such a large platform? And I mean, I think the short answer is yes. It's often exciting, even though you don't want to be pigeonholed. It's like, you should write for this person because they look like you. There is something to the idea that, like, how many HBO shows are there with Asian lead characters, and if you get to write for one, that is kind of access that not many people get. So yeah, as you can probably tell by my rambling, I have many feelings about it.
And I would say, like, I think that character in Westworld was not generic Asian guy. He mild-mannered tech dude, but we need to see that guy again, by the way, just putting it out there. We do have another question from audience members, which I actually love this question. I was going to ask you this myself. Can you talk about your own experience as a parent and the impact on your writing?
Yes. It's so many good questions. I guess I wrote 3 out of 4 books had at least some overlap with me being a parent. So I've only written one book, my very first one, where all of it was written before I had any kids. But it's changed over time even then, right? I mean, as the parent of like infants, and now the parent of like, you know, like when I was finishing Interior Chinatown, my kids were kind of tweens, I guess. And they really inspire me. And I know that probably just sounds like a little bit syrupy, but it's true. I mean, I steal from them. I get a lot of good material from them. I won't tell you which lines, but a lot of I think it's probably somewhat obvious, but they say things that I couldn't come up with, so I just straight steal it from them. Um, but really, I think another part of it is it's really humbling to be a parent. I am constantly, either second guessing myself or just considering what I could have done better, or you know, all the pain and the joy of it. Uh, it it informs a big part of it. It also changed the way I see my parents when I became a parent myself. So I'm not saying anything that people that don't already know, I guess.
But to follow up on that, I mean, I think that it's really, and that's an interesting question, because so much of the work that you've done does actually focus on that parent-child relationship, and it has to do with a sense of obligation, responsibility, what you owe that parent, which I think is really interesting, that, as the adult child, you can never really live up to the role that is expected of you, which I see is so much a part in interior Chinatown. And that sense of sibling rivalry, and the end with, I have to say, the end of the novel is a very tour de force. I won't spoiler it for anyone who hasn't read it. But the notion of the court case and what is actually on trial, as older brother is litigating, something bigger than law and order, but something about Asian American politics, and our role in American culture, was so much of a tour de force. Clearly, you've been reading Asian American studies. I have to put in a plug there, because the universal quality of interior Chinatown is absolutely present at every moment in this novel, but also the specificity, the particular, engagement with the nature of how certain populations are marginalized is so much part of that work.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Professor.
And so I have to ask you too, like, are there stories that you would like to see more of, either in novels or in television? And what are some of those stories that you think are not being represented?
Oof. I think there's such I don't know. I mean, I've read a lot more in the last couple of years than I've read in past years for lots of reasons. I feel like there's such an incredible explosion in a lot of ways, both in TV and books, of like points of view and people that now have access to either publishing gatekeepers or, TV/film gatekeepers. That to me, it's an exciting time to get to learn about points of view that I hadn't, seen before. I think there's one particular thing that I think I'm somewhat fixated on that I'd love to see more of is I love work stories. I worked, in a sort of certain, very sort of specific kind of environment for many years, but um, I love getting to see, both how people spend their work lives and what that does to you, internally, across a huge range. I think there's, it is such a big part of our lives, both in terms of quantifiably, but also psychologically. And I'm especially drawn to those. So, you know, yeah,
Even though you don't have to go to the office anymore?
maybe that's why. Maybe
Oh,
it's a
you
job.
missed it. You miss your office politics.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, give me a good accounting story. I really miss.
And so can I ask you, as we're closing in on our time, this is kind of a big question, but do you have an ideal reader? When you think of the audience that you're reaching through your writing, is an image of a reader come to your mind?
Um, no specific like demographic image, but I do think there is a feeling, there, like as I was reading earlier, it hit me, that, or I was like, I had the memory, the sensation of reading a lot of these words to myself over and over again when I was like, is this working? What's wrong with it? How do I get this to work? And and then later, as it started to get more polished, I had the feeling of, oh, I I'm I started to get excited about the prospect of someday a stranger picking this up and reading these words,
Mhm.
and both excited and really anxious. I'm like, because the imposter syndrome is ever present for me. So the feeling of like, oh, I'd love for someone to pick this up and feel like it does something to them, but also, what if this is all just garbage? And that feeling is always there. So, um, but I think the person is, um, me, 20 years ago, when I would go into a bookstore and really look for something weird, not the thing on the front tables, but the thing where I'm like, I haven't even heard of this. I'm only looking at it because the spine caught my eye, or it's next to the thing I'm looking for, or I don't know, maybe I have heard of it, but I open it up and it just, it's like a side door into some place that I hadn't been. That was what got me to start writing, is going into bookstores and doing that. And I'm looking for that person, whether they're a writer or not. I think often that search is by someone that might also want to create, but it also just as easily could be someone who just loves reading and wants to find that book. So I guess that was a little bit of an abstract answer, but that's the person.
Well, it's so funny to hear you say that, because I think, Charlie, one of the reasons that you're on the front table now, right, at this moment in this culture, is that you were true to your vision that you describe as weirdness. But now the entire country is kind of with you. They want those racialized horror stories. They want those racialized sci-fi stories. And I think that notion of the social conscience, as it is even in this notion of entertainment, right, in your new novel, has been so gratifying that you're the front table now, and you've brought that weirdness out of those corners. And of course, we're all there with you. So congratulations. As we're ending and towards our time together, you once said about your literary success, quote, "It's never far from my mind about how much luck comes into it." Now you've been nominated for a National Book Award, one of our highest achievements in the country for literary achievement. Do you still think it's luck?
Yes.
I'm going to challenge that, but I want to, we're at the end of our time, and I want to say thank you so much, Charlie, for joining us here in Madison under little different circumstances than you were here 4 years ago, but we wish you the best of luck. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Professor Bo, and thanks, Connor, and thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed it and all the questions.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie. Your questions were absolutely wonderful. Charlie, as were your answers. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to the 100 people who watched at home this evening. I think Leslie's comments about the front table couldn't be more true. And I also want to underline the fact that events like this are possible because authors do great work. And we hope that you'll support that work if you can by clicking the green button at the bottom of your screen and buying a copy of Interior Chinatown, and maybe, all of Charlie's works. Who knows what you do when you get to the Room of One's Own website. But please support our booksellers. Please support our authors by buying the book. I also want to thank our two program partners on this event, the UW Center for the Humanities and the Department of Asian American Studies. They are routine supporters of the book festival, but this year any support of the festival really feels special, and so thank you very much to them for their ongoing support of free cultural events in Madison. Charlie, open invitation whenever you can. We'd love to have you come back to Madison. We'll get you on an early in the day flight, and maybe you won't have to take off of work. You can just come. So thank you so much for your talk tonight, and we hope to see all of you again tomorrow for our Wisconsin Wednesdays event with the UW program in creative writing. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.